Could there be a better form of government than the one we have now? As we enter an AI world, when are we going to submit to an AI leader? Will your grandchildren ever vote for a human president who comes with a political party and all the weaknesses of a human? Or will they vote for an AI system that has a jaw-dropping capacity to extract patterns from vast pools of data and simulate millions of possible futures and govern with a deeper sort of wisdom than a human could ever have? Will we each have personal AI agents that know our strongest political opinions such that we finally achieve, for the first time at scale, a direct democracy rather than a representative democracy? So today I'm going to talk about the future of an AI president, pros and cons, and where I think we are inevitably heading. Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist at Stanford, and in these episodes, we dive deep into our 3-pound universe to understand some of the most surprising aspects of our lives and our futures. For the past year, I've been diving deep into putting together a new idea. So I want to start at the very beginning and work up to what I see as the inevitable consequences. So what we do in our current times is we ask 2 candidates to campaign for a position. It's a binary choice. Do you want to vote for Kamala or Donald? One's a Democrat, one's a Republican. They go around, they give speeches, they shake hands, try to persuade voters. Or maybe you're voting for some proposition. It's a 30-page document and you have to vote. Are you for it or are you against it? Now, the question I want to ask is whether that's actually as good as our system can get. Suppose, and I know that some people will have no problem with this supposition, suppose that in a future decade from now, AI consistently makes better decisions than humans. Just imagine that reliably over the course of years, its forecasts are more accurate and its recommendations are leading to the kinds of outcomes we want. And its foreign policy advice seems to be preventing wars that human politicians would have stumbled into. And its disaster planning saves millions of lives year after year, decade after decade. At what point would our continuing to insist on human leadership attached to some political tribe or another, at what point would this seem sentimental? That's the question I want to explore today, the ins and outs and the pros and cons, because I suspect that although the idea of having an AI president seems like science fiction right now, this is going to eventually become obvious. I assert there's a very high chance that one day we are going to willingly hand over enormous amounts of governance to artificial intelligence. And just for the sake of a concrete example, today we're going to consider the presidency. Now, to be clear, I'm not predicting this is going to happen in the next decade or even in my lifetime, because laws will have to change, constitutions would have to change, and our conception of political authority will have to evolve. But I am suggesting this is essentially inevitable. Obviously, we are happily taking advantage of new medicines or scientific mysteries getting cracked or asking for AI's help in understanding climate systems or economics or biology or engineering. And the question that to me seems absent from the conversation is, should we ask it to help lead us? Can we take on governance that actually plays 4-dimensional chess? Now, this is all a big claim, the idea of an AI president someday. So the rest of this podcast is going to be my attempt to earn that conclusion. So let's start with what would count as a vastly superior leader. Everyone in Silicon Valley is asking the question of whether AI is smarter than us. And we have lots of intelligence benchmarks. But I want to talk about it being wiser than us and wiser than any human king or president or prime minister could be. Okay, so let's talk about wisdom. Let's say that you meet an 18-year-old who's absolutely brilliant, and we all know some young person like that. Let's say it's a kid who understands quantum mechanics or writes amazing software, composes music, but you probably wouldn't ask them to navigate an international crisis or even to be the CEO of your company, because there's something else that accumulates with time, and that is wisdom. And wisdom is mostly about pattern extraction. Pattern extraction is a term we often hear from venture capitalists. The good ones have seen hundreds and hundreds of companies succeed or fail. Maybe at the beginning of their career, they were fooled by some really charismatic founder, or they passed over some really shy founder who they shouldn't have, or whatever. But eventually, with time, they learn which signals matter and which don't. Every success and failure gets worked into their neural networks until eventually they're carrying around something that we call good judgment. This is why all of us become better decision makers as we age. Even though lots of aspects of our cognition are declining and processing speed decreases, but our wisdom grows because we've watched a lot of plans succeed and fail. Now, I think this is one of the central challenges of politics, which is that politicians want to do the right things, but it's very difficult. And this is for three reasons. The first reason is that society is a gigantic network of interacting people and incentives and traditions and markets and technologies and schools and cultures and families and on and on. And when you pull on one thread, a dozen others move. So as a result, we can see that most legislation produces unintended consequences. And I want to be clear, this is just because legislators are human, and governing millions of interacting people is the most difficult system problem that our species has ever attempted. And the issue is that brains are really only capable of thinking in straight lines, as in, if A happens, then B will happen. You raise taxes and revenue changes, or increase prison sentences and crime changes, or build more housing and homelessness changes. We really can't help but think about one cause leading to one effect. The problem is that societies don't work that way. A society is one of the most complicated networks ever assembled. Every decision ripples through thousands of interacting parts. So if you change a housing policy, that affects where people live, which affects traffic, which affects businesses, which affects school enrollment, which affects tax revenue, which affects policing, which affects employment, which affects crime, which affects voting patterns, and so on. And all of these changes feed back into one another. It's a huge web. And this is why legislation so commonly produces unintended consequences. I'll just give an example of this. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and a few years ago, the city of San Francisco wanted to reduce the harm that was caused by incarceration for minor theft. So they said, look, if you shoplift something less than $950, no problem. We won't prosecute you for that. The idea was if you have fewer people entering the revolving door of prison, then maybe that'll make things great. But of course, if you followed the story, you know that the outcome was far more complicated because stores increasingly had mass shoplifting that was well organized and just kept things under $950. A lot of businesses ended up struggling and closed or left the city. And after a few years, the policy was reversed again. Now, independent of whatever your politics are, we see this kind of thing over and over, that good intentions are never enough, and steering a giant network is very hard to do. Again, politicians and legislators are trying their best, but they're trying to solve problems that are just larger than any single human mind can wrap around. So that's the first problem. We're dealing with a giant nonlinear network, and it's impossible for us to think about thousands of interacting variables at the same time. The second political challenge for humans is one of time scale. There's an often told story about the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai, who was asked what he thought about the impact and legacy of the French Revolution of 1789. And he replied, "It's too early to say." Now, Western listeners loved this because they said this is the kind of centuries-long view that the Chinese take. Now, as it turns out, it was just a translation confusion because Enlai thought that he was being asked about recent student protests in France, and that's what he was addressing. But AI can actually make that real. It will actually have the capacity for vast multi-generational patience and very long-term thinking. An intelligence that persists for decades or centuries and looks at that kind of data can ask very different sorts of questions. It can evaluate all sorts of reforms by observing generational movement instead of administrative cycles. The key is that it can think in timescales that biological brains just rarely have the luxury to inhabit. Okay, so the second problem is timescales. We just have short lifespans, and we only have a few short decades to try to accumulate wisdom. The third political challenge for humans is human nature. Now, there's no doubt that human brains are astonishing. They invented agriculture and math and literature and music and spaceflight, but we are also prone to jealousy and overconfidence and tribalism and fear and short-term thinking. This is just the way that the hardware goes. So given this, why do humans go into politics in the first place? Many people do this for the right reasons. They want to improve things. But let's also acknowledge something about human nature. Leadership comes with rewards like status and prestige and influence and power and admiration and resources. Our species evolved in small tribes where this kind of status really mattered. If you were a high status individual, you had greater access to food and allies and mates. And those ancient motivations are down in the engine room of any modern brain. And one of the issues that face every elected official is they have to think about the next election and think about their donors and their political constituents and public opinion and tomorrow's headlines. So they're always trying to say the right thing at the right moment. Just imagine trying to make a decision that you think is going to benefit society 2 years from now, while knowing that it's going to make everybody really angry right now. That's a hard position for people to occupy, and so they generally don't. And by the way, these foibles of human nature are why democracy builds the insightful assumption that human beings are imperfect and ambitious and tribal and biased. So instead of trying to find a perfect ruler, democracy rotates the leadership and creates checks and balances and says to the citizens, look, we're going to assume that you'll get disappointed. And so you've got this chance to replace the person. In other words, the genius of democracy is to assume that people are not angels. Okay, so those are three enormous challenges for humans in politics. Politicians and legislators have to think about giant nonlinear networks. We have short lives, and we are marked with all the blemishes of human nature. But AI will have none of those problems. We're soon going to have decision-making systems that don't crave status, they don't worry about re-election, they don't hold grudges or owe favors or make the right moves for a lucrative job after leaving office, or become exhausted after 8 hours of negotiation, or wake up in a bad mood because it slept poorly. And it's going to be capable of compressing vastly more experience than an individual human like Kamala or Donald ever could. So just imagine the application to governance. Right now, we think about questions like, should we make taxes go up or go down? But what if instead you had AI asking, okay, here are 50 million possible policy combinations. Which one is most likely to increase economic mobility over the next 20 years while preserving innovation and improving mental health and reducing violent crime and encouraging entrepreneurship and protecting civil liberties and strengthening families and minimizing environmental damage? You just can't ask a human legislature to tackle that. There are just too many moving parts, and our brains evolved to tackle much simpler kinds of problems. But you feed this problem to AI along with decades of economic data and public health records and weather patterns and education statistics and transportation networks and migration trends and crime data and energy production and demographic shifts and technological forecasts and thousands of other streams of information, and then ask it to build simulations, millions of them. It can ask, what happens if inflation rises and autonomous vehicles become widespread and the birth rate falls and another pandemic occurs, and on and on. A paper just came out, which I'll link in the show notes, where a research group simulated the interacting behavior of billions of artificial people. Now, this was the first paper of its kind at this scale of population simulation. And these sorts of research studies are only going to get better, by which I mean they'll be even more nuanced and have better predictive power. They'll get better with each passing month. So this is why every law that the AI wants to propose could be stress tested against millions of possible futures before we ever have to make a vote on it. Now, this is completely different than the way legislation is written today. Today, a bunch of lawmakers show up with their intuitions. Now, these might be pretty good and experienced intuitions, but they're not arriving with a living model of society itself. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that an AI model could predict everything, because humans are very unpredictable and new technologies appear and natural disasters occur out of left field. History always surprises everyone. But prediction doesn't have to be perfect to be incredibly useful. Weather forecasts are imperfect, but they're way better than having no forecast at all. So when it comes to governance, instead of endlessly arguing from ideology, we could begin with simulations. Show us what happens under 1,000 different futures. That totally changes the quality of the political conversation. So we're in such an amazing time right now, because every previous generation, when they thought about forms of government, they just had the same raw material to work with, which is human minds. So whether you're talking about monarchies or democracies or republics or dictatorships, all of these relied on myopic brains that evolved on the savannah to navigate life in small groups. So now that we're inventing a different type of intelligence, all the benchmarks are concentrating on whether it is smarter than we are, but the harder and more interesting thing to measure is the ways in which it can be wiser than us, by extracting massive patterns, doing so over huge timescales, and not having human foibles. And this is where AI starts to look really compelling for thinking about running a country. Now, I suspect that many people are going to react that having an AI president sounds dangerous, and the idea might even strike them as offensive, because democracies are built around human representation. You might argue that AI didn't grow up in your hometown, and it doesn't know what it's like to be a human in the ordinary sense. All that's true. But what if what we're heading for is not a worse form of democracy, but just the opposite? What if we're heading towards a much deeper, richer, better democracy? So here's what I mean. Imagine that instead of the extraordinarily low bandwidth way that we all express our preferences, like Kamala or Donald, or for or against some proposition, given that our political preferences are actually quite a high dimensional landscape, imagine instead that every citizen spends 25 minutes being interviewed by an AI agent. Large language models, LLMs, are excellent at conducting long, nuanced conversations and asking follow-up questions and summarizing really complicated viewpoints. So instead of having to get off work and go to a ballot box each year, imagine that an AI asks you lots of questions and gets to know how you feel about things. What concerns do you have about immigration? How much uncertainty are you willing to accept in exchange for faster economic growth? How do you feel about balancing privacy with public safety? Now, the way I just phrased those questions could be done a lot better, so that an AI is asking very simple and answerable questions to people and digging deep to figure out which trade-offs matter to them most. And by the way, I think an interesting thing would also be to figure out what you don't care about or don't have any opinion about and just want to abstain on. So the AI can quickly and accurately figure out what issues you are passionate about and precisely what your position is on those issues. Now, could an LLM be good at this? Well, in March of this year, Anthropic published what is the largest qualitative study ever. So instead of asking people surveys with checkboxes, they did qualitative research, which means deep, open-ended conversations. They built a custom AI agent that conducted one-on-one conversational interviews with 81,000 people simultaneously. Just to level set here, a team of human researchers would take years to interview that many people. And the AI did it all at once, and it asked follow-up questions, and it dug deeper into vague answers, and it adapted to the user's responses. All this would have been impossible to imagine 3 years ago. And by the way, when I think about the future, I picture that maybe we could do this AI interview biannually with your agent. And once your LLM knows you well, it could be a very quick conversation to see if anything has changed. So now you have democracy on steroids, because here you have hundreds of millions of voters, each of whom has an agent, and each agent carries a quite sophisticated model of their human. And these agents all converge to a centralized system that can make extraordinarily complex legislation, that actually gets what the people want, that actually listens to the voices of its citizens in a rich and sophisticated way that preserves the nuance. Now, for all of history up until this moment, the idea of capturing really rich information from every person would have been absolutely impossible to consider. But now, for the first time ever, we could have a large-scale direct democracy. This is different from what we've always had, which is a representative democracy where we elect representatives to vote for us because there are too many of us and we don't have time to get involved with everything. And we all walk around with the hope that whatever representative is in the chair is making some even rough approximation to what you would actually want. But again, we're usually given just a few choices, which get winnowed down to 2 choices, and almost never will someone be keeping your exact desires in mind. But now we have a chance for a direct democracy, which is a much deeper kind of democracy. Everyone gets a stronger and more meaningful voice because the technology finally makes it practical to hear from everyone in detail. Now, just as a side note, I mentioned this to a friend the other day, and he said some people will give joke responses to their AI agents. They won't take the interview seriously. And of course, that's true. But that's true also with our current voting system. Each year, candidates like Bart Simpson and SpongeBob SquarePants get thousands of write-in votes. And the most frequent fictional write-in vote across American elections still is Mickey Mouse. Now, obviously, people do this as a way to express frustration or exhaustion with the available candidates. But I suggest that we would actually have less joking votes because you can express your preferences with great subtlety. And you don't have to get cornered into 2 choices that you're trying to visibly protest. So instead of just for or against some proposition or candidate, we would be really understanding the positions of people in the nation, which can be very nuanced, and there's no reason that AI can't tackle that problem, giving us a totally new flavor of democracy. Now, there's a second concern that people might express, which is, what if the AI models get so complex that government is no longer understandable to us? But we should acknowledge that most of the institutions that already shape our lives are so vast that no single person understands them. Take something like the legal system. No lawyer understands it all. No judge does. Thousands of people devote their lives to understanding just tiny corners of it. Or think about the electrical grid. no single engineer understands every moving part of the enormous machinery that delivers electricity across our entire nation, but we're okay with a system like this. We trust it because it reliably does its job. And its job is something that no individual mind could possibly coordinate by itself. So modern civilization is already filled with systems like this that exceed any one human brain's understanding. And so the idea that government needs to be simple enough for us to understand, I think, is a non-starter. Okay, so now on to a related concern. Some people will worry that AI might get rid of human judgment, but I think it's just the opposite. I think it's going to enlarge the space in which human judgment can operate. So one of my favorite examples of widening the space is something I've talked about before on this podcast, which is what happened with the ancient Japanese game of Go. People have played this game with the black and white stones for 2,500 years. And so you'd think that all the paths and strategies would be well worn by now. There have been champions in every generation for millennia. But what happened is when AlphaGo came along and beat the world champion, the key is that it was like opening an alien landscape because the human champions of the game had never thought about these moves that the AI did. There were all these moves like playing 6 stones in a row instead of 5, or putting a stone in the middle of nowhere. These turned out to be really interesting and powerful moves that now human Go players do regularly, because what was happening here is that the AI expanded the space of possible moves into realms that people had just never thought about before. And I think this issue of widening the frame will be absolutely critical in governance. We'll see moves that we never thought of before. I'll give just an example here. People will sometimes say that AI can't reason morally, but I think the situation is more interesting because already AI systems have shown remarkable ability to widen the frame of moral questions. So imagine a discussion about criminal justice. Humans naturally bring to the table anger and fear and compassion and outrage and loyalty and personal experience and political identity. But AI can widen the frame. It can ask questions about recidivism and the statistics there, and community stability, and long-term rehab, and economic costs, and victim outcomes, and mental health, and family structure, and public trust. All these issues will always get bigger whenever we get AI involved. I recently read a paper, and I'll post this on the show notes, that was exploring AI's role in political mediation and peacekeeping between countries. And it was looking at how these AI systems can help resolve conflicts by identifying solutions that competing groups just hadn't thought of. And this sort of research really captures my attention because we don't have to think about AI as an oracle or a moral authority, but instead we can notice that it expands the search space. You see this all the time, that people of political tribes walk in the room believing there are just 2 possible answers, and the AI suggests a 3rd answer, or a 10th, or a 100th. So just like the game of Go, where moves that initially looked bizarre eventually became recognized as brilliant because they opened regions of possibility that humans had just not explored, governance is definitely going to experience more and more moments like this, where AI suggests a policy that no human legislature has ever imagined before. Or the AI will suggest a treaty that satisfies competing interests in some unexpected way, or a tax structure that improves dozens of outcomes at the same time. This is the sense in which AI is going to widen our frame. Okay, so at this point, you might be thinking, fine, let's imagine that AI is extraordinarily capable and can model society and can run simulations and can see bigger patterns than we can. But what exactly is the right kind of policy? It's not like there's a single policy position that everyone's going to automatically agree on. So how do we think about this? Well, I think it's the same way that we answer young people when they're asking for advice about their career choice. We ask, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for income or learning or creative freedom or long-term impact? Because the young person has to get that straight to know what fundamentally they are looking for. And governments face exactly the same challenge. Should a nation optimize for economic growth or for social equality or for innovation or for freedom or for security or environmental sustainability or public health or future generations? All of these goals matter, and all of them have trade-offs. So there's no single way for us to say which future is correct. It's all a matter of which things you care about the most. And there's nothing new about this question. We've been wrestling with this for as long as we have historical evidence. But if you want my opinion, we could make progress by, for example, looking at something like the philosophical concept of utilitarianism, where the emphasis is on maximizing well-being across the greatest number of people. I think we could get AI to be increasingly good at this, and we could put in a pedestal of rules that it has to operate on top of, like protecting individual rights no matter what, emphasizing fairness no matter what, and emphasizing liberty no matter what. And then on top of that base, the AI works to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, I want to be clear that every policy is going to capture something valuable and leave a lot of difficult questions, and AI is not going to make those philosophical conundrums disappear. And this is why, at least for the foreseeable future, human beings are still going to decide the broad goals of what we want to build. But once we have the broad goals, there are a million possible paths, and human government only explores a tiny fraction of them. And AI could explore many more. Okay, so now let's look at the pathway that might bring us there. Maybe we begin using AI with a county budget, and then we move to something like transportation, and then something about environmental policy, and then economic planning, then legislative recommendations and judicial advice. And then one day, perhaps some decades from now, a child is going to be learning in history class that there was once a time when humans insisted that the most important decisions affecting hundreds of millions of people at a time had to be made by whichever politician happened to win a popularity contest every 4 years. And perhaps that child is going to find the idea as quaint as we find the notion of kings who once ruled by divine right. Now, even though I'm thinking about this on the timescale of decades, I do want to say there's also a possibility that this could happen much faster. And that's if you get something like Taylor Swift to run for office with the AI and says, look, I'm very popular. Don't worry about the fact that I'm not an expert politician because I have in my corner this awesome AI and I'm just the human face who's here to get the vote, and I'll bring in here the real expert. And that's one possibility for how this could all happen much more quickly than expected. And what interests me is if we keep extrapolating outward and asking whether this is an idea that will eventually widen so that we'll someday have AI leadership for the whole planet. I mean, we've tried to do this sort of thing before with the League of Nations and the United Nations and even the European Union and so on. So the question is, will we ever end up not just with an AI president in the United States, but a world leader AI that extracts massive patterns of data and looks at what is going on and tries to adopt a utilitarian perspective that maximizes the good for everyone in the world? Now, through our early 21st century eyes, we imagine that we're always going to have a human sitting there in the Oval Office with veto power, and maybe that's true. But I will say that history has a way of blurring distinctions that once felt permanent. And at some point, maybe 100 years from now, we might decide that it's like making the Waymo drive around with the human driver sitting there just in case. And at some point, we might say, you know what? This thing drives 8 times better than a human, so we don't need the human in the driver's seat anymore. Now, I want to say that every idea we've explored so far depends on a massive amount of trust. The second that somebody proposes giving greater authority to an AI system, that opens up a lot of questions, and it should. So the first question is about what is the data that's getting used? It seems clear that this is going to be one of the defining political questions of the coming century. And I've argued before on this podcast that I have a little bit of a fear that we are in a golden age of AI right now, where all the major companies use the whole internet and all the digital books to train up their system. But the future that I worry about is that soon enough, people are going to say, hey, I really don't like what's going on the other side of the political spectrum, so I'm just going to leave that garbage out of the training data. So I'm afraid that if the political polarization continues, we're going to start seeing a balkanization of frontier models in the same way that on social media, you have Blue Sky and X, and they simply don't rely on exactly the same data, the same agreement of reality. Now, when it comes to governance, getting only partial data will dilute an AI's ability to really become a boundary-pushing oracle. Because in this limited data scenario, it's being spoon-fed a fraction of human thinking by humans who believe they know what qualifies as politically offensive or dangerous. And as soon as someone starts excluding certain historical accounts or certain scientific literature, or certain economics literature, they might believe they are protecting the public, but you'll get an AI that is more limited in its thinking, and you'll end up with a collection of oracles, each of which reassures its followers that they were already correct. And that would be a tragedy, because AI only becomes wiser if it learns from the full breadth of human experience. Otherwise, we're just building a sophisticated echo chamber. So number one, as far as trust goes, we have to be very careful with making sure that data is not excluded. The second trust concern is about reasoning. What happens when the AI recommends a policy that sounds completely unintuitive? Now, one could imagine this is just a big black box that just announces its verdict and everyone shrugs and obeys. I don't think this is how this is going to unfold. One of the remarkable abilities of AI systems, even today, lies in their ability to explain their reasoning, and this is only going to get better. So imagine an AI president that can present evidence and citations and historical examples and competing viewpoints and the results of millions of simulations and sensitivity analyses. And then we can say, hey, explain this to me like I'm a fifth grader or a college student or an expert or whatever. And we can each get an understanding at whatever level we want of why it chose what it chose. It can explain to you why one recommendation survived millions of simulated futures, while another repeatedly produced undesirable outcomes. So at some point, for the first time ever, we'll have legislation that has the same kind of evidentiary threshold that you have for science papers or for court decisions or that engineers use to persuade each other. There's no reason our governments shouldn't aspire to that same standard. They've just never had the tools to do so, so we didn't even imagine this. Okay, so the first trust issue is about the data that's used for training, and the second one is about reasoning and explainability. The third trust issue is a big one. It's about who controls the AI system. I think it can't be a company, but instead it has to be an open AI model where anybody can query this, anybody can read the weights, and it has to be fully open source. Anybody can go to GitHub to read the architecture. Just imagine that you could do this with a human president, see into his or her brain so that every decision is totally transparent and not owned by donors or corporations. So this has to be something we build together as a national nonprofit using all of the data from our world. There are a million details to be worked out there, but I'm guessing most people would agree that we don't want it to be owned by a particular company. And this is how we would get to full transparency and explainability. Okay, and now we're at a point where we can ask a different question, which is, how are people going to take this idea of an AI president? Now, you might think people will rebel because we'll probably see 100 screenplays coming out in the next few years with a human hero rebelling against AI overlords. And I get that kind of story. That kind of story about a motley crew of rebels rising up against a big power. It's an old and successful theme, but I think there's an interesting reason why rising up against the AI might not be our inevitable future. And that's because people are much more willing to take advice and listen with an open mind to the arguments of AI than they are to other people. There are many research studies on this now, and I'm going to attach several of these to the show notes. The general story is that people are able to listen to AI more than their fellow humans. And here's how to understand this. When we talk with other humans and argue with them, we don't want to seem like we've been beaten by someone else's logic. We hate that because it suggests there was something wrong and inadequate with our logic. And in the human dominance hierarchy game, we hate losing. But we're much more happy to be convinced by AI because those social dynamics don't apply. This is true even with losing a game of chess. People hate losing to another human, but they're much happier to lose to a computer. Okay, now let me play the other side for a moment here, which is going to lead us to a very crazy possibility. It just might be the case that many people don't dig the idea of an AI leader, and I suspect that human nature will probably always be a barrier here, because the fact is that we want certain things like cures for diseases and safer airplanes and bridges that don't collapse, but we also want a lot of things that have nothing to do with optimization. We like participation. People care about identity politics. We value struggle. We care about the feeling that our choices matter. So if we felt like we had little choice in our governance and we didn't know what it was up to, we could theoretically have a much better life, but one that feels empty of meaning. So, for my craziest sci-fi speculation here, the question that I keep wondering about is whether we actually want the AI to be totally transparent, or whether eventually we come to trust it enough to take more control and actively hide things from us. So this sounds crazy, but let me give you an example. Given the psychology of our brains, I think war is probably inevitable. We evolved in tribes and our brains are predisposed to divide the world into us and them, in-groups and out-groups. And you see this in sports and in politics and in religions and in sub-religions. I don't think those instincts are going to disappear just because our technology improves. And so here's the craziest thing that I'm going to bring up. I think there's a world in which we might want the AI to fool us. The AI sets up sports games for us, sets up competitions that are harmless but fake, but we don't know that they're fake, and it lets us get our energies out this way. In other words, maybe we don't actually want the future AI to be totally transparent in its decisions as long as humanity does better in the end. Now, this is a very provocative idea and, of course, invites all kinds of questions of security and how we could ever know if we could trust it if it were doing things to fool humans. Even if that led to better outcomes, that may well be a bridge too far, because humans will always want some role in shaping their collective future, even when the AI might provably produce better outcomes. Every generation wants to challenge the structures it inherits, and that instinct might never disappear. And maybe it shouldn't. A civilization that doesn't question itself eventually becomes fragile. And so this may be the thing that limits the power of AI governance, so that instead of turning the dial to 10, we keep it at a 7, even a century from now, so that it is a partnership instead of leadership. So let's keep checking back in to see what actually happens here. So let's wrap this up. I began this episode by asking whether and when we will take on an AI president. And to some people, this might sound like a very provocative question because it sounds like submitting our power to an AI. But I want to be clear that submission isn't the picture that we have to have here. And to make this clear, I think there's a very interesting analogy with dogs and cats. There's an old saying that when you feed a dog every day, the dog concludes, "You must be a god." When you feed a cat every day, the cat concludes, "I must be a god." So here's the way I'm seeing it. Maybe we are going to build something, an AI system that spends every moment solving impossible human problems. It gathers huge streams of data. It builds models. It simulates. It searches through feature spaces that no human mind has ever thought about. It negotiates among the models, and then it hands us the results. Cleaner air, safer cities, fewer wars, healthier children, stronger economies, more opportunity. It does all the hard work and we get all the benefits. And so the possibility I want to paint here is that the most intelligent system our species ever creates might not be our master, but our greatest public servant. And we, the beneficiaries, will be like the cats instead of the dogs. This is obviously very new territory we're entering, and I'd really love this discussion to be two-way, so please go to my Substack, davideagleman.substack.com, to join the discussion with any ideas or criticisms or comments. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. And check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.